Accessibility is something that doesn't get talked about enough in game design. The conversation of how accessible games need to be and how the end goal of accessibility should be achieved is a conversation that's existed for a really long time. But to the average consumer, no one really thinks about it. But it's extremely important. After all, if something about your game prevents people from playing it and enjoying it, then the game isn't going to be very successful, is it? Usually when people think of accessibility, they're thinking of stuff that appears in the options menu. Things like colorblind mode, photosensitive mode, toggle options for button mapping, subtitles and language options. Things like this are super important. Why should photosensitive epilepsy, colorblindness or repetitive strain injuries get in the way of somebody being able to have fun on your game? This is the most basic way developers can make games accessible, and you'd be shocked to see how few games actually do this sort of thing. I talked about accessibility options in Celeste in a different video of mine, and someone commented that the accessibility options that I was praising them for were only added in the most recent patch of the game, so that says quite a lot. People who are hard of hearing might struggle to play games where audio cues are extremely important. A solution to this is displaying all important audio cues as text on the bottom of your screen. Subtitles are a really obvious one for those who are hard of hearing, and most games have subtitles nowadays. But please can we start making subtitles that are actually good? Subtitles should contrast well against the background of the game, and they should have the speaker's name on the subtitle. How is anyone supposed to read this text for ants at the bottom of the screen when they're sat on their sofa 2 meters away from the screen? Subtitles should also display all dialogue during gameplay, not just cutscenes, especially in stealth games, where guards declaring that they've spotted you is vital to gameplay. Games having subtitles is great, and it's super common nowadays, but we can do better. Remapping controls is something that most players can appreciate in a game. It's good for everybody, but most people don't realise that it's also extremely important as an accessibility option. If you have carpal tunnel syndrome, stretching your finger to the control key to crouch might be too hard for you. Games that don't allow you to remap that button to somewhere else on your keyboard are essentially shutting you out of playing that game. Carpal tunnel might also make it hard to hold down a button for a long period of time, so a game allowing you to make buttons toggleable is also important. Instead of holding down control to crouch and letting go to stand back up, have an option that makes it so that pressing the button once crouches and pressing it again uncrouches. Pressing multiple buttons at once can also be hard for people with repetitive strain injuries. Spider-Man Miles Morales has a really cool feature that allows you to map shortcut buttons onto your D-pad. So if you personally find it hard to input multiple buttons at once, you can remap that combination of buttons to one single button. But here's where we start reaching the controversy. If your game is meant to be difficult, and is meant to have extremely complex and mechanically intensive combos, is adding this accessibility option going to negatively impact the experience for everybody else? If King of Fighters allowed you to press a single button instead of doing this insane motion input, would people still bother to learn the input? Would the game be as skill expressive? An even more minor detail, if having these pop-ups appear on your screen makes it less likely that you'll miss an audio cue, then why would anyone ever turn them off? They allow for deaf and hard of hearing players to experience the game, but they also give everybody else an objective advantage. Should these accessibility options be left out of games to maintain the experience for everybody else? Well, I think there's two answers to this question. One of them is a lot less complicated than the other. So, in single-player games, there is no excuse whatsoever for leaving out any accessibility options for anybody. But in multiplayer games, where you are competing against other players, the question becomes a lot harder to answer. I mean, sometimes it's obvious. Subtitles, photosensitive options, colorblind mode, remappable controls, obviously put those into your multiplayer games. But settings that give you an objective edge over your opponent are a tricky one. If in Valorant, there was a hard of hearing setting that allowed you to display text on your screen whenever you heard a gunshot, footstep, or ability used, that would drastically affect gameplay. And every single player that enabled this setting would be getting an objective advantage over people that didn't have it enabled. Max range footsteps that would be near impossible to hear in-game would be displayed as text on your screen, easily readable. What about single button press supers in Street Fighter? Clearly much easier to execute in a pinch than this motion input that would certainly ruin the competitive integrity of a game. In single-player games, the difficulty of a game can be altered to benefit the player, because nobody else is negatively impacted if your personal experience is easier or harder than somebody else's. But in a multiplayer game, you having an easier time than your opponent is literally an unfair gameplay experience for one player. I'm kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, I think that games should be as accessible as possible, but on the other hand, I think that game designers should be able to make their game in whatever image they desire, and I don't think competitive integrity or balance should take a back seat over accessibility options. These are two conflicting opinions that I simultaneously hold, and I'm having a complete existential meltdown just thinking about it. Even difficulty settings are an issue for me. On one hand, I hate difficulty settings, because I have no idea what difficulty to choose before I've played a single second of gameplay. But on the other hand, having an easier option for the person that wants to enjoy their game at their own pace is a great thing. They get to enjoy the game and it doesn't impact me negatively in any way, and the game reaches a wider audience as a result. On one hand, developers should be able to make games crushingly hard if they want to, and appeal to just the most hardcore players, but on the other hand, shutting out players just because they're not good enough feels terrible for the consumer who just spent 40 quid on a game that they're never going to play ever again. Dark Souls shouldn't have an easy mode, it shouldn't need one. But Celeste's assist mode is a genius way to make a hard game accessible to everybody. L-cancelling, pretzel motions, frame-perfect B-hops, these are all great ways to show off skill and allow the best players to always win, but they entirely prevent a casual audience from competing at all. I wish I could end this video with some sort of definitive solution to this problem, but I don't have one. If you like this video, I have a few others about a similar topic. They'll be linked in the top right. My mic quality was worse, but the script quality was just as mediocre, so maybe you'll like it. Also, something, like and subscribe, I don't know. If we can end on a word of advice, I'll just say this. Fix your goddamn subtitles, I'm begging you, it's so annoying.